Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today, we are diving into the long-forgotten roots of abortion policy in America, an origin story that just might upend everything you thought you knew about the law, morality, and power. Let's rewind the clock to the 1800s. Believe it or not, abortion was not always the cultural flashpoint it is today. In fact, before the 1850s, abortion was generally legal in the United States, at least before something called quickening. That's the moment when a pregnant woman first feels fetal movement, usually around the 4th or 5th month. Until then, terminating a pregnancy wasn't typically prosecuted, and in most cases, it wasn't even regulated. So what changed? Why did a practice that was once a private affair between women and their caregivers become a criminal act? Enter the American Medical Association, the AMA. In the mid-1800s, the AMA wasn't just trying to promote health. It was trying to consolidate power. Midwives, homeopaths, and herbalists, many of them women, held a lot of informal influence in their communities. The AMA saw them as a threat to their legitimacy and to what they considered professional medicine. So the strategy was clear: discredit the competition and seize authority. And one of the most effective ways to do that was by targeting abortion. The AMA launched a campaign to criminalize the procedure, not primarily on religious or moral grounds, but as a calculated move to marginalize midwives and bring reproductive health care under their exclusive control. It was about medical monopoly, not morality. Between 1850 and 1910, states began falling in line. One by one, they passed laws banning abortion. This wasn't a sudden moral awakening. It was a coordinated effort. The wave of legislation wasn't coming from the pulpit, but from the professional class, cloaked in the language of legitimacy and public safety. And the justifications? Well, they weren't quite what you might expect. The early moral arguments for criminalizing abortion didn't center on religion. Instead, they leaned on ideas of professional authority, state power, and, disturbingly, early eugenics. There were concerns about population quality, racial hierarchies, and managing the so-called unfit. This was the era of social Darwinism, and lawmakers began tying abortion to broader ideas about controlling society's future. In short, the move to outlaw abortion wasn't purely moral, nor purely legal. It was strategic, it was systemic, and it planted the seeds for everything that followed. This origin story reminds us that laws aren't written in a vacuum. They're shaped by power, professions, and the politics of the day. And sometimes, what's justified as safety is really about control. In the wake of World War II, something profound began to shift, not just in geopolitics or economics, but in bedrooms, courtrooms, and doctors' offices across America. The year was 1960, and a tiny pill would quietly spark a revolution. With the approval of the first oral contraceptive, women were handed something they had never fully possessed before: the control. Control over reproduction, over timing, over their own futures. It wasn't just a medical breakthrough. It was a cultural and psychological reset. The pill symbolized freedom, autonomy. For the first time, millions of women could decouple sex from childbirth, planning their lives, careers, and families on their own terms. But that freedom brought legal questions and backlash. You see, while contraception was becoming more accessible, abortion remained dangerous and largely illegal. And that led to what we now call the unsafe abortion crisis. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, thousands of women resorted to underground procedures, many unregulated, unsanitary, and life-threatening. Stories of women dying from botched abortions filled newspapers, whispered through hospital corridors, and echoed through civil rights and feminist circles. Public outcry began to grow. But here's where things get interesting, because the legal system wasn't exactly consistent. In 1965, the Supreme Court decided Griswold versus Connecticut, ruling that married couples had the right to access contraception under the right to privacy. That was a game changer. It introduced the idea that reproductive decisions, once considered taboo, deserved constitutional protection. But it also created a contradiction. How could contraception be protected as a private decision, while abortion remained criminalized? The legal logic didn't add up, and the courts knew it. At the same time, several states weren't waiting around. By the late 1960s, momentum was building. States like California, Colorado, and New York began liberalizing their abortion laws, making exceptions for rape, incest, or threats to a woman's health. Reformers were pushing hard, and they weren't just shouting from the streets, they were knocking on the doors of legislators and judges. So by the time the 1970s arrived, the stage was set. The contradictions were too stark, the laws were too uneven, and the demand for reform had grown too loud to ignore. All of this, the pill, the crisis, the contradictions, and the momentum, laid the groundwork for one of the most explosive legal decisions in American history. January 22, 1973, a date that would send political shockwaves through every courtroom, church pew, and campaign rally in America. The case was Roe v. Wade, and at its heart was a woman named Norma McCorvey, known publicly as Jane Roe. She was a young woman in Texas who had become pregnant and wanted an abortion. But Texas law at the time only allowed abortions if the mother's life was in danger. That was it. So she sued, and what started as a personal legal battle grew into a national referendum on reproductive rights. The Supreme Court ruled 7-2 in favor of Roe. But the court didn't just say abortion is legal. That would have been too simple. Instead, they built the case around something deeper, a constitutional right to privacy. Specifically, the court argued that under the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, individuals have a right to make personal medical decisions without undue interference from the state. Abortion, they concluded, was one of those decisions. To manage the tension between individual rights and state interests, the court introduced a trimester framework, an attempt to balance a woman's autonomy with the state's interest in protecting potential life. In the first trimester, the decision was left to the woman and her doctor. In the second, the state could impose regulations related to health and safety. And in the third trimester, when the fetus could be viable outside the womb, the state could prohibit abortion, except when necessary to protect the mother's life or health. Now, let's be clear. This was a seismic shift. With one ruling, Roe struck down dozens of state laws. The immediate impact? Massive. States scrambled to rewrite legislation. Politicians took sides. Religious leaders rallied. And the courts? They suddenly found themselves at the center of a moral and legal firestorm. But Roe wasn't just about abortion. It raised bigger questions about privacy, bodily autonomy, and the role of the judiciary in shaping social policy. For supporters, Roe was a landmark victory for women's rights. For opponents, it was an act of judicial overreach, an unelected court making sweeping moral decisions for the entire nation. And that tension, it never went away. The legal earthquake of Roe didn't just reshape the law, it cracked open a cultural divide that would only deepen in the decades to come. By the 1980s, Roe versus Wade wasn't just a court case anymore, it had become a symbol, a lightning rod, a battle line drawn right through the heart of American politics. And the first major player to seize this moment? The moral majority. This was a rising coalition of evangelical Christians and social conservatives who saw abortion not just as a policy disagreement, but as a defining moral crisis. To them, Roe wasn't just wrong, it was a sign that America had lost its way. Led by figures like Jerry Falwell, the moral majority didn't just preach, they organized. They built a political machine that mobilized voters, lobbied Congress, and transformed churches into voting blocs. Abortion became the flagship issue of the religious right, and it never left. Meanwhile, the legal landscape was shifting too. In 1992, the Supreme Court decided Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Now, here's where things get complicated. Casey upheld Roe's basic premise, the right to abortion, but it also opened the door to more restrictions. States were now allowed to impose limits as long as they didn't place an undue burden on a woman seeking an abortion. Sounds vague? That's because it was. And states took full advantage. Suddenly, lawmakers had room to maneuver. They didn't need to overturn Roe. They could simply regulate it into submission. This led to the rise of trap laws, targeted regulation of abortion providers. On paper, these laws were about safety, wider hallways, admitting privileges at nearby hospitals, even requirements about the width of parking lots. But in practice, these were surgical strikes on clinics. They made it harder, and in some cases, impossible, for providers to operate, especially in rural areas or conservative states. Meanwhile, abortion became a partisan litmus test. Want to be a Republican candidate? Oppose Roe. Want to be a Democrat? Defend it. Judges, too, were increasingly chosen based on where they stood on this single issue. This wasn't just law, it was strategy. Political operatives realized that abortion could mobilize voters, secure funding, and define entire campaigns. It became a cultural wedge that divided communities, families, and even the courts. And underneath it all was a quiet irony. A decision originally intended to settle the issue had, over time, made it more polarizing. Roe didn't end the debate, it supercharged it. So by the time the new millennium arrived, the legal battlefield was saturated with restrictions, and the cultural battlefield was more divided than ever. What started as a fight over privacy had become a war over identity, faith, and political power. After nearly 50 years of legal precedent, one case, just one, tipped the entire balance. Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, 2022. This wasn't just another legal dispute. It was a direct challenge to the foundation laid by Roe versus Wade and reinforced by Casey. At the heart of the case was a Mississippi law banning most abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy, well before the point of viability established under Roe. The law was designed, very intentionally, to provoke a constitutional showdown. And that's exactly what it did. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 to uphold Mississippi's ban. But they didn't stop there. In a sweeping decision, the majority went further, overturning both Roe and Casey outright. Just like that, the federal right to abortion in the United States was gone. Let that sink in. A half-century of legal protections dissolved in a single ruling. Justice Samuel Alito, writing for the majority, argued that abortion was not a constitutional right. He claimed it wasn't deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition, and therefore didn't qualify for protection under the Due Process Clause. But the dissenting justices, Breckinridge, Kagan, and Sotomayor, sounded the alarm. They warned that this ruling wouldn't just affect abortion. It could open the door to future challenges against other rights grounded in privacy, contraception, same-sex marriage, even interracial marriage. The fallout was immediate. Across the country, states triggered abortion bans. Some had laws already on the books, just waiting. Clinics closed their doors overnight. Protests erupted in every major city. Legal confusion spread like wildfire as people tried to make sense of what had just happened. For some Americans, it was a long-awaited victory. For others, it was a devastating loss. But for all, it marked a turning point, a legal, political, and cultural rupture unlike anything the country had seen in decades. This wasn't just about one law in Mississippi. It was about the power of the judiciary to reshape lives, about whether rights can be permanent, or whether they're always just one ruling away from disappearing. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear: the age of Roe was over. A new era had begun, one defined not by a single federal standard, but by 50 divergent state responses, each with its own politics, laws, and consequences. In the wake of Dobbs, the United States didn't just revert to the pre-Roe landscape, it entered something far more chaotic. A fragmented, contradictory, high-stakes legal maze. Welcome to post-Roe America, where your reproductive rights depend not on your beliefs, but on your zip code. Some states wasted no time. Abortion access was slashed or banned outright. Others rushed to shore up protections, codifying abortion rights in state constitutions or passing new legislation to shield providers and patients. The result? A national patchwork, a legal quilt stitched together with conflicting laws, overlapping jurisdictions, and ideological divides. Let's start with the basics. Divergent state laws now define the landscape. In some states, abortion is banned at conception. In others, it remains available through most or all of pregnancy. And in between, you'll find every variation imaginable: 6 weeks, 15 weeks, exceptions for rape or incest, or none at all. This legal disarray has real consequences. Clinics have closed in one state and opened in another. Patients have crossed borders, sometimes hundreds of miles, to access care. And activists on both sides have shifted tactics in response. Which brings us to telehealth. In a digital world, geography isn't the barrier it once was. And so, the demand for remote abortion care has skyrocketed. Online pharmacies, FDA-approved abortion pills, and virtual consultations have allowed patients in restricted states to receive care discreetly, but not without controversy. States have tried to ban or criminalize the mailing of medication. Legal battles have erupted over federal authority versus state bans. And providers now find themselves operating in murky legal waters, risking prosecution to serve their patients. Meanwhile, the courtrooms haven't cooled down. Far from it. We're seeing legal and political clashes unfold on multiple fronts. Lawsuits over mifepristone access, battles over whether a state can criminalize travel for abortion, and questions about whether federal protections can override state restrictions. This legal warfare is unprecedented. And then there's a new generation stepping into the spotlight. Younger activists, many of whom came of age after Roe, are bringing fresh energy, digital savvy, and decentralized tactics to the fight. They're organizing on TikTok, protesting in state capitals, and creating rapid response legal networks. Some are fighting for total bans, others for total freedom, but all are shaping the conversation in new and unpredictable ways. The post-Roe era is not a return to the past. It's a leap into uncharted territory, where law, medicine, politics, and technology collide in real time. And at the center of it all is a question that won't go away. Who decides? The state? The individual? The court? Or the culture? Now let's step back and zoom out. Forget for a moment the slogans, the headlines, and the protest signs. Let's talk systems, structures, incentives. Because when it comes to abortion in America, the outcomes aren't just shaped by personal beliefs. They're shaped, often invisibly, by the architecture of law and power. The post-Roe legal landscape didn't just decentralize authority, it fractured it. 50 states, dozens of court cases, countless local jurisdictions, and all of them trying to navigate conflicting rules with no central roadmap. This isn't just confusing, it's unsustainable. First, Let's talk about conflicting jurisdictions. Imagine a doctor licensed in one state prescribing abortion medication to a patient in another, where that medication is illegal. Is the provider criminally liable? What if the patient travels across state lines? What if she doesn't? Now throw in the federal government. What happens when federal agencies approve medications or policies that certain states outright ban? Welcome to the new battleground, federalism versus state sovereignty. It's like watching a tug-of-war between overlapping legal systems, with real people caught in the middle. Then we've got incentive distortions. States with strict bans often claim they're protecting life. But what happens when that ban pushes patients to seek underground procedures, or when doctors hesitate to treat medical emergencies out of fear of prosecution? What's incentivized isn't better care, it's legal defensiveness. Doctors spend more time talking to lawyers than to patients. Hospitals delay procedures while ethics boards deliberate. And women in crisis face layers of bureaucracy instead of immediate care. Now let's flip it. In states where abortion is protected, there's another risk: the creation of political pressure zones, where advocacy groups, lawmakers, and legal strategists push for broader protections, sometimes without fully accounting for ethical nuance or the need for dialogue. The result? Entrenched positions, echo chambers, more polarization, and all the while, ethical questions remain unresolved. What's the moral weight of viability? Who defines when life begins? How do we balance competing rights when the law fails to draw clean lines? These aren't questions the court can answer with a gavel. They are questions of conscience, of philosophy, of what kind of society we want to live in. But here's the thing about systems: they create their own logic, their own incentives. And when those incentives prioritize political wins over personal well-being, everyone loses. So maybe the real issue isn't just abortion. Maybe it's how we build laws, how we distribute power, and whether the systems we rely on are truly capable of handling decisions this complex. Let's take a breath. After everything we've just covered, from the quiet legality of the 1800s to the roaring debates of today, one thing becomes clear: this was never just about abortion. It was always about power, about who decides, about how a society balances personal liberty with public policy, about how a legal system handles moral questions that don't come with easy answers. Because when courts hand down sweeping decisions, from Roe to Dobbs, they don't just shape policy, they shape reality. They change what's possible and what's punishable. So the question we're left with is this: when the law changes, what actually shifts? Do we see justice, or just a new set of incentives? A new set of winners and losers in the legal lottery? Let's talk about judicial power for a moment. In a functioning democracy, courts are meant to interpret law, not make it. But in cases like Roe and Dobbs, we saw courts become architects of policy. Entire national frameworks were built or torn down, not by elected legislatures, but by a handful of unelected justices. That's not inherently good or bad, but it is risky. When rights are defined from the top down, they can be erased just as easily. And when people feel those rights are granted, or denied, by institutions they don't trust, disillusionment grows. That's where federalism enters the chat. In theory, federalism offers a solution. Let states decide. Let communities reflect their values. But in practice, that creates legal fragmentation, inequality, and deep confusion. A woman's rights in one state vanish when she crosses a border. A doctor praised in one courtroom is prosecuted in another. And that's not just a legal problem, it's a human one. Because at the core of all this isn't just a fight over policy, it's a reckoning with responsibility. How do we protect both autonomy and life? Who bears the weight of enforcement? How do we craft laws that leave room for conscience without collapsing into chaos? Maybe the answer lies in stepping back from extremes, in resisting the urge to weaponize every ruling, in building systems that don't just impose order, but invite dialogue. And maybe, just maybe, we need to remember that law is a tool, not a substitute for morality, not a shortcut around hard conversations. Because the history of abortion in America isn't just about one right. It's about how we handle all rights, how we protect them, debate them, and sometimes, how we lose them. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If this video made you think, or if it challenged something you've heard before, hit that like button, drop a comment, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives into the stories beneath the surface. And if you want to explore more hidden truths they never taught you in school, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. The link is in the description below. Until next time, stay curious and question everything.